Welcome to week 8 of SED 445, where we will be looking at reinforcement. So reinforcement describes a relationship between two environmental events, a behavior, which is your response, and an event or consequence that follows the response. And there's two types of reinforcement. We have positive reinforcement, which can occur only if the behavior increases or maintains its rate as a result of the consequence. There's also negative reinforcement, and you can call it negative reinforcement only if the behavior increases or maintains its rate when some environmental condition is removed or reduced in intensity. So for our individual behavior change projects, we are kind of simulating an FBA and a behavior plan. So if you go out into the field and ask another teacher, hey, does that kid have an IBCP? They're not going to know what you're talking about. It's really for the purposes of this class that we're calling them that. But we are simulating a functional behavior assessment and a behavior plan. So when you write your behavior plan for a student, there's usually some sort of reinforcement. So something that is strong enough for students to choose over the problematic behavior to engage in. So when we look at negative reinforcement, we don't want to think of it as a bad thing, like negative as in bad. But when something is removed or reduced, for example, when I drive the speed limit, I do it in order to not get a speeding ticket. So when we look at kind of the wording of it, if I were to say I'm driving the speed limit to increase my safety, then it would become positive reinforcement, the safety part. So sometimes it really depends on the wording. Punishment describes a relationship in which a behavior is followed by a consequence that decreases the behavior's future rate of occurrence. So punishment only occurs when the preceding behavior decreases. It is easily confused with negative reinforcement, though. So the speeding ticket weakened my behavior of my speeding. So the speeding ticket was at one time a punishment for the behavior of speeding. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. They're weakening the behavior that you don't want to see. And then there's extinction, which we've discussed earlier, and that's when a previously reinforced behavior is no longer reinforced. Its rate of occurrence decreases. So if we think about the student who often blurts out in class and you teach them the replacement behavior of sitting quietly and raising your hand. And so he knows what is expected of him, but he continues to blurt. So when you're practicing extinction, you are withholding attention from that behavior of him blurting out. And you're positively reinforcing maybe other students in the class who are raising their hand, and maybe the student kind of catches on and raises his hand, and then you positively reinforce, great job. But the absence of reinforcing him blurting is where you're practicing extinction. And like I've talked about earlier, there is a phenomena called extinction burst, where a student will kind of figure out, well, hey, maybe she didn't hear me, or they'll continue the behaviors and perhaps ramp up the intensity before it goes away. It is extinct. So extinction is when you had previously reinforced a behavior and you no longer reinforce it, also called withholding attention. So here's a little graph to kind of have you visualize the differences between positive reinforcement, punishment, and negative reinforcement. So when a positive event is presented, it is positive reinforcement. And the effect is to strengthen the behavior, okay? When a positive event is withdrawn or avoided, that is punishment, okay? So I'll use an example. High school students may have like an open campus kind of deal, and they're allowed to go out for lunch. And so if they start coming in late from that lunch, it could be taken away temporarily. So that would serve as a punishment. And the effect is to weaken that behavior. Whereas if an aversive or unwanted or unpreferred event is presented, that is called punishment. And the effect is to weaken the behavior. Whereas if an aversive event is withdrawn or avoided, that is negative reinforcement, and the effect is to strengthen that behavior. So something for us to consider is don't call something positive reinforcement or punishment until you actually know the desired effects. So if we think that, for example, recess is a positive event for many students, but we don't really know if it is a positive event for all students. So if we're taking away recess, thinking it's a punishment, but in reality, it's an aversive event, they hate recess, and it's taken away, that is negative reinforcement. So that is actually positive to the student. Okay, that's preferred for the student. So that's actually going to strengthen whatever behavior, right? So be aware of what you think is, a preferred or positive event and aversive or unwanted events for students. So really get to know your students and their preferences. Other terms you might have heard, so modeling is the demonstration of the behavior and hopefully the behavior you want your students to demonstrate. So if you kind of consider, if I'm always late to class, what am I modeling for students? So when you're thinking of lead by example, this is modeling. Shaping is reinforcement of successive approximations, so small little chunks, to a desired behavior to teach a new behavior. So you may want to do perhaps a task analysis and start breaking up what you want to occur for the new behavior. Stimulus control are consequences that are presented during the development or learning stage of a behavior such that the current antecedent now serves as a signal or cue for the behavior. So this is a potential for difficulties in generalizing from school to home and or home to school. So for example, if a student is allowed to swear and curse at home and then they're coming into school where that is not acceptable, you might have some potential difficulties there. So how do we determine reinforcers? Well, you can ask the student verbally. You may ask them to write a journal entry or a prompt or fill out entry or exit slips or surveys. You could do a reinforcer survey or menu. This allows a teacher to control the choices and avoid problems of students suggesting reinforcers that are not viable. So that way we have a little bit more control over what we're willing to give in our classroom. Reinforcer sampling provides a variety of different consequences or activities in observing which have the strongest effect on students. There are also great resources out there such as preference assessments. I will link one, I'll make a note to myself to link one into our folder for this week. So you can kind of see what a preference assessment might look like for a particular student. So there's many ways that you can determine reinforcers. When we're determining reinforcers, we want to also consider the function of the behavior that serves their purpose for engaging in that behavior. So if the function is attention from the teacher or another adult, you can consider spending time with the teacher, such as lunch or helping out in the classroom, as a reinforcer that you could offer. Being allowed to maybe call their parents. You would want to check home first before you allow this, but that could also be something you could offer. Positive notes home, helping other teachers, or participating in school or community service acts. If the function is attention from peers, you could have a reinforcer be being a peer tutor or being able to tell a joke or funny story to the class or sharing something, earning a reinforcer for the entire class, being allowed to choose peers with whom to partner with. If the function of the behavior is escape, you may want to consider, getting out of work coupons, You would be surprised at how hard students will work to get out of work. It's ridiculous. So if you can get ahead of that and make that option available, that will sometimes serve you in great ways in your classroom. So you could also consider earning reinforcer dots that can be applied to an opt-out of a particular item or section of an assignment, tokens, things of that nature. If the function is power or control, you may want to consider a reinforcer such as assisting the teacher or other teachers or staff. The principal in my school, I know, would be totally on board with if I wrote a behavior plan for having a student earn time to help her out. That student would be thrilled and I'm sure would have great success with the behavior plan. So being really creative, helping peers or peer tutoring, earning the ability to make choices or decisions for themselves or in class activities, stories, etc., operating class technology. If the function is status, perhaps allowing them to earn reinforcers for the class or group. They're thinking, this guy's so cool, he earned us a free recess, whatever. Being allowed to choose other students to partner with on tasks, working as a peer tutor or buddy, doing special jobs in the classroom. So those are just some suggestions. Some recommendations. Unless the behavior assessment suggests otherwise, social reinforcers can work best because they're free, they're readily available, they're relying on material. Reinforcers can really become expensive. When you're trying to maintain that prize box, it can get really pricey. So think of things that are free. Think of, privileges that are acceptable. So social reinforcers may be appropriate in general education settings, and they may be less disruptive than material reinforcers. So you think of that prize box and he's got this big new yo-yo that he's whipping around. You may not want to be giving those out. Ensuring that the system of reinforcement is consistent and that access to reinforcers is contingent upon student exhibiting the desired behavior. So if the student can access the reinforcer without exhibiting the desired behavior, then the reinforcer itself will lose motivational value. So if you're bringing this kid out for extra recess every single day, regardless of if he's exhibiting in the desired behavior, you're losing the power for that reinforcer. So negative reinforcement also maintains or increases desired behavior, but through a different process. So when we're thinking about our individual behavior change projects, we are thinking about positive reinforcement, okay? Things that we're adding to preferred activities or reinforcers that are presented, not taken away, okay? And to, help them not avoid something, right? So also maintains or increases desired behavior, but through different process. It involves removal or avoidance of an aversive or negative stimulus once a behavior occurs. So in other words, if there is an aversive or unpleasant condition in place, even the potential for such a condition, once the desired behavior occurs, that aversive or unpleasant condition ends or the person avoids it. So negative refers to the presence of the aversive, negative, or disliked stimulus that is in place prior to the behavior. So you think of me in my my driving, my speeding, okay? So generally, negative reinforcement is unplanned and not systematic because the teacher must design a negative situation, and we don't want to do that in our projects, okay? So something for you to consider. Next week, we are going to look at reinforcement schedules and what those can look like in your classroom. So again, I will post that preference assessment to our Week 8 folder for you to check out and just be thinking about your IBCP projects. And I look forward to seeing you guys on the boards. Have a great week.